Museums are more than places we visit on a field trip. Across the country, museums protect our shared history, care for wildlife and collections, strengthen local economies, support job training, and spark curiosity in people of all ages. Right now, you can help make sure museums stay strong for future generations. Museum Advocacy Day is a national moment when people contact Congress to ask for continued support for museums and the federal agencies that fund them. Learn how to take action at aam-us.org and tell your representatives that museums matter to education, to communities, to the economy, and to our democracy.
Welcome to a bonus episode of Geek Warning, the cycling tech podcast from Escape Collective. I'm Dave Rome, and this episode is a dive into the world of torque wrench usage. Hey, this is Geek Warning after all. I last covered this topic back at Cycling Tips. Figured it was time to revisit it as I continue to see common mistakes throughout instructional content on social media and YouTube. To help get geeky, I'm joined by Alex Boone, a member of Escape Collective, but perhaps more importantly, he's a product lead at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. A former bike shop rat turned super secret fastener turner, Alex knows the ins and outs of using a torque wrench and how best to apply that in bicycle terms. For more on this topic, head on over to escapecollective.com for my latest edition of Threaded, where I largely summarize and in some cases show what's discussed here. Just a quick note for those listening on our free feed. Like many of our podcast episodes, the full-length versions are only available to our members. We're a young media business trying to cover the sport of cycling without taking revenue from those we write about. And it's our members who make everything we do at Escape Collective possible. If independent journalism matters to you, you want access to all that we offer, or you just want a website that's not trash to look at, then please consider joining at escapecollective.com/geek warning. Okay, on with the show. Alex Boone, welcome to Geek Warning.
Thanks, Dave.
Where do we find you right now?
I am in Mayday, Colorado, outside of Durango.
Okay. Very nice part of the world. Yeah, I guess for people that don't know you, I mean, you're an Escape Collective member, but I'd say that's not what you're known for, and that's not quite the career. A few years ago, you helped me with a torque wrench principles article, which was very insightful. And back then, I think we could have called you a rocket scientist, maybe?
Maybe being generous.
Okay. What's the career that's got you to this point? And I guess why do I have you on to talk about torque wrenches?
Well, I guess I'll start by saying I grew up working in bike shops in high school and college, and there was always a torque wrench, usually collecting dust somewhere in a toolbox. But when I finished university, I went on to start my career in aerospace manufacturing, and that led me to working for the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, starting, I guess, almost 10 years ago now. And I worked in a quality engineering role there for many years. Do something slightly different now, but in my time in that role, I was hands-on with spaceflight hardware, working with a lot of large and small bolts where work matters a lot.
Okay. And any extraterrestrial beings listening, where would they have seen your work?
Oh, I can't tell you about that, but you'll have to ask them about this.
Okay, very good. Well, yeah. So, I mean, the background in cycling, and you're still a very passionate cyclist, so you're still pretty hands-on with the tools, still using tools and torque tools in cycling applications, and then combined with that, should I say highly certified field, makes you quite an interesting person to talk to on this subject. So thanks for joining us. I guess to kick things off for people that start from the very beginning, like, what is fastener torque?
I mean, I guess you could think of torque, like the technical definition would be that it's a rotational force applied to a fastener that is equal to the force times the length of the lever. So if you think about putting like 1 Newton of force on a 1 meter long lever, that's 1 Newton meter. But I think for practical purposes, especially when it comes to bike work, torque, it's basically used as an indirect way to measure clamping force or preload across a bolted joint interface.
Yeah. So, I mean, in an ideal world, we'd be able to measure like the tension on the threads themselves, but that is not something so accessible to us in our little cycling world. So yeah, the outcome is that we're measuring basically the tightness of the bolt head, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I guess to go a step further, then, like when it comes to being able to measure torque, you need a torque wrench, and there's, I guess, quite a few different ways to go about that. Should we talk through some of the different torque wrenches that are available?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So yeah, first on the list, I'd say, and probably the most rudimentary of them, is a beam torque wrench. How would you describe that?
Beam torque wrenches are great. I mean, I think they are super cost effective. They're pretty accurate, and they're generally pretty reliable. You basically have a beam that, as you pull on the torque wrench, one piece bends and the beam does not, and it points to a little scale on there. So it's very rudimentary, easy to use. I think you see them a lot. I think the one thing that you give up with a beam style torque wrench, however, would be like repeatability or precision, just because sometimes it's difficult to read the scale when you're using it, especially depending on the application. Quality ones are definitely nice. And it also gives you the ability to measure running torque, which I know we'll come back to that at some point.
That's definitely an interesting feature. Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned like it's kind of it's almost open to interpretation of beam wrench, right? Like it's
right.
You're watching the scale as you're applying the torque, and it is easy to sort of overshoot that figure. It can also be a little awkward in bicycle applications where you might have, like, say, a big crankset bolt that you're trying to torque quite tightly, and your line of sight is not in line to the tool, and so there can be times where there can be a little bit inconvenient to use, but yeah, it is a very simple tool that basically just relies on like the natural flex of a material, and that's so yeah, they stay in calibration, very cheap, and yeah, very very easy to use. So I guess there is also a second kind of beam torque wrench called a deflecting beam, which I mean, how that's basically just a beam wrench with like a little clicker on it, and once it hits the number, it makes an audible click. Is that a fair description of that?
I personally don't have a ton of hands-on with that style of wrench, but yeah, I believe you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, they were kind of it's an old design, but I'd say for a one time there was only like an Australian company, Warren and Brown, that was still manufacturing them, but I'm starting to see them coming back in other places. I think like Tecton Tools, I think in the US have started to manufacture them again. So anyway, let's get on to the most common type, which is the click style torque wrench. How do these things work?
It's my personal favorite, and you're right, they're super common. I mean, you see them a lot in the bicycle space as well as automotive and aerospace, and it looks very much like a regular ratcheting wrench, but you have some guts inside of it that will sort of break away or click when you reach a desired torque. So you can preset to discrete values. And then as you're torquing that fastener, when you reach that set torque value, it will click. And those are super nice because you get this really nice tactile feedback when that torque is reached. So like we were talking about a minute ago, if you've got sort of a blind bolt that you're reaching down to torque, it's nice because you'll feel that through your hands when you reach that torque.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
And they're also super repeatable. So I think if you were to hand the same wrench to 5 different people, you'd probably get very consistent results.
Okay. Yeah, cool. I think it's probably worth noting, like, some of the things we're going to get into do revolve specifically around the use of click torque wrenches. And I guess, for anyone wondering how these things work, I'd probably just suggest maybe jumping on YouTube and looking for an explainer into a click style torque wrench, or what the inside of a click style torque wrench looks like, just to understand, if you want to understand why some of these principles are the way they are. So all right, well, next on the list, digital. I think it's as the name describes, it's digital. It's battery operated, it has a little screen. How are these things working out?
The digital torque wrenches are neat, and I think it seems like you see more and more of them nowadays. And I think they're cool because you can often get a very broad range of torque across a digital torque wrench, with no degradation of accuracy across the scale, which is something that's really nice. But I mean, it's essentially like a little force torque sensor inside of an enclosed unit. And a lot of them nowadays you'll see like either LED or have some sort of audible feedback when you've come to 70, 80, 90% or 100% of your torque. So unlike a clicker style wrench where you get that tactile feedback, you get some other sort of feedback letting you know as you're getting close and when you reach your final torque.
Yep. And also like the beam wrench that you mentioned running torque, which we might explain in a moment. But digital torque wrenches can also provide that because
right.
It'll show you the force you're putting in live time. So lucky last, the dial gauge torque wrench. I mean, I'll probably this one isn't so common in cycling circles because they tend to be pretty fancy still, and
Yep.
kind of an older tech. But basically, it's like an analog version of a digital torque wrench. Is that probably a fair way to summarize it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's it almost looks like a watch dial. And I mean, I have used these a lot for very small fastener applications at work, where you're talking about measuring things in the low inch ounce realm, and maybe you also need to measure the running torque on a fastener that's that small. And so you've got this little analog bezel the dial will go up, and you can see your running torque, and then there's usually like a little sliding piece that will stick at whatever your highest final torque value was. So like when you've twisted it and you stopped and you pull the tool away from the fastener, you can go back and read what your final torque value was.
Oh, neat.
But very expensive, very precision type things. And I don't know if I'd ever use one on a bike application unless I was just, wanting to be fancy.
Yeah. And I think it's of all of these, if you have a propensity for dropping tools like many of us do, that is the one that'll most quickly lead to tears. Yeah. So what am I forgetting on that list? Is there something else?
I think the only other one that I'd mention that I don't see a ton in the bicycle space, but you do see it in aerospace, would be like a breakover style torque wrench. So it kind of looks like an open-ended, box wrench type thing, typically set to a preset torque value. You will see these sometimes used for like coaxial fittings, where you have a relatively low torque and you reach that final torque. And when you do, the wrench just sort of folds over on itself. There's like a little fulcrum pivot point that just bends, and when you reach that's when you've hit your final torque.
Yeah. In a way, they kind of work like a preset version of a click style torque wrench.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mechanically, it's like this little tab that breaks free and lets the wrench click apart. So we kept talking about running torque. I think we may as well just explain that now. What is running torque? And I guess in a cycling application, where might you want it?
I mean, in really simple terms, running torque is basically just friction between the fastener and the thread interface. I think, anyone who has installed, a 6-bolt rotor, a little M5 rotor bolt onto a wheel that has a big blob of blue Loctite that's dry on it, understands what running torque is like, because you can't just thread it in freely. You get maybe 1 or 2 thread engagements, and then you get into that Loctite, and then you really have to crank on it. And so that force that you're feeling is resistance, the thread's resistance, that is running torque. But you can also get that, from other ways, depending on the material of the fastener, the surface roughness. There's a million different things that can contribute to that. But typically in cycling, you'll experience it through things like dry Loctite.
Yeah. And I guess in cycling, we have had some examples recently where that dry Loctite has even led to a recall coming to mind. Like SRAM had a recall on its shift levers not so long ago because that running torque was I guess causing not enough clamping force on its shift levers connecting to the drop handlebars. And so they were experiencing pretty widespread like slipping of the levers on the bars, and their recommendation was like to effectively clean off that Loctite, so therefore the running torque wasn't impacting the torque measurement as
right.
Yeah, so it's certainly applicable and worth knowing about. I think, does your advice still hold when it comes to running torque regarding factoring it into the number?
Yeah, I think if you are working with a fastener that has a big blob of dry Loctite on it and you feel that running torque, I think it's worth considering that. And now, if we were building spacecraft, we would say, we would just get a different tool and measure that running torque. And if you can characterize it, then you just add that number onto whatever your prescribed torque was. So if you're talking about, a road shift lever that maybe is at 6 Newton meters, that's what they say. That's assuming that there's no running torque. If you have 3 Newton meters of running torque, you just add that to the 6. And so you would set your wrench at 9. But of course, that assumes you have the tools to measure that. So I think for practical purposes, it makes more sense to just clean the threads, maybe put some fresh liquid Loctite on there, and then just do it up to whatever the factory specification is.
Yep. Yep, solid advice. All right. Well, that gets us very perfectly onto the next thing on the list, which is wet versus dry fasteners and the impact of that on torque. I think this is a big one, and I think this is like really fundamental to everything when it comes to like wrenching on a bicycle. I think is these sort of fundamentals of that, like a dry bolt and a lubricated bolt will fasten up differently and basically have a different clamping force for a given torque. Yeah, can you go a bit more into that than what I just did?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, it sort of follows the logic of the running torque with the example of the dry Loctite, where, you're feeling that resistance. You're getting that on a smaller scale if you put, say, a dry fastener into a dry hole as well, right? Because that interface between the threads is going to have some non-zero amount of resistance. And if you take it a step further and say you put some sort of a grease on both the threads and, like what NASA does, we'll even say put it underneath the head of the fastener, because as you tighten that head down, that can have a pretty significant impact as well. When you do that, the amount of torque that you need to achieve the same effective clamping load goes down quite a bit.
Yeah, and I guess where it gets confusing, and this is something you helped a few years back over at Cycling Tips, we did some research in this, is that in some cases in cycling, the brands themselves don't really, they provide a recommended torque, but they don't really seem to have a grasp on this subject. And so they don't really specify what grease to use or how to apply that grease or whether the fastener should be with a dry Loctite patch or a wet Loctite patch. It's just very rudimentary figure that they give. So I'd say this is still one area that there's probably still some blind spots within the cycling industry.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
I think brands are getting better though. And I mean, an example that comes to mind for me is like SRAM's UDH, because it's a co-molded, like resin and metal part. They're pretty explicit in the instructions to not put any grease on that thread.
Yeah,
we're getting better.
We're getting better. Like I think another brand, just like give positive shout out to, like, I think Specialized does a pretty good job with this in its like user manuals. It'll show you exactly where to put grease and where to apply Loctite and where to what torque each bolt should be at, and it's very just clearly shown. So I think we're getting there, but always room for improvement. I think, speaking of wet versus dry, I think it's probably worth noting that like dry would just be like absolutely no lubricant at all on the bolt. It'd just be like a perfectly clean bolt. Ultra dry would be rusted. That's not a thing, but wet can be a few different things. So like different greases will have a different level of friction.
Absolutely.
I think, generally speaking, Loctite when applied wet is similar to a regular grease in terms of the amount of friction it produces on a moving fastener. But then it gets complicated because not everyone uses a wet Loctite. There are paste Loctites, and there are the factory set Loctites that we spoke about, that sort of like the tape based stuff. And then there's also the topic of anti-seize, and I know that some tests have been done there.
You took the word right out of my mouth. Yeah, not all pieces are the same, right?
Yeah. So I know anti-seize tends to create more lubricity. It tends to result in a higher clamping force for a given torque versus a grease. So just little things to, I guess, put in the back of your head when you're if a brand says to use grease or to use anti-seize, just consider that it may be having an impact on what that torque is doing.
Yeah, for sure.
Anything else out on that topic?
I guess just a request to the bike brands out there, please be explicit. Tell us whether it's a dry bolt, patch lock, or with grease.
Awesome. Okay, that's a fair request. All right. One of the topics I've put on the list, and this one might be a little bit hard to follow in podcast format, but we'll give it a go. Which is, I have a theory, and I'm hoping you can back it up, which is why torque at lower ranges matters more than torque at higher ranges. So in my mind, in a bicycle application, I'm thinking like the use of a torque wrench matters more on a bolt that needs 3, 4, 5 Newton meters versus one that needs 40 Newton meters. Thoughts on this?
I think it's important to understand torque requirements for every bolt to joint interface, but I agree with you that for some of the lower torque applications, the consequences can be more expensive. I think surely people out there will have accidentally cracked a seat post or a carbon handlebar or something like that. But I think if you do one too many ugga-duggas on a dub crank bolt, it's probably not going to hurt anything. You may just have a harder time getting that thing out when you have to undo it because the aluminum threads have galled in the spindle.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So where my head's at with this is like people will maybe use a lower cost tool or not a torque wrench at all and just look at the 5 Newton meters recommended on that carbon handlebar and stem interface and just think, oh, close enough is good enough. But the difference between like a 5 and 6 Newton meters as a percentage is quite significant versus, if you're tightening a bolt to 40 Newton meters, that same variance might be, the difference between 40 and 55 Newton meters. And so it becomes a really scary number. And so, yeah, I think it's, in my mind, it's just like, think about the percentage difference that you're applying. And this is why I think you'll typically find more stress and more focus in cycling applications around the use of like smaller torque wrenches around your M4, M5, M6 fasteners, around your handlebar and that sort of safety critical thing.
Absolutely.
Whereas like the use of a torque wrench on a crankset is less common.
Yeah. And I think, going back to the discussion about whether your fasteners are lubricated with grease or Loctite or something like that, subtle differences like that can be amplified on these really small fasteners. I mean, like stem bolts or an M5, at maybe between 3 and 5 Newton meters for a lot of this modern stuff. That can have a big difference if your torque wrench has, maybe a 5 or 6% accuracy tolerance, and the effective clamping load that you're applying goes up a lot if you're putting a high quality grease on it versus maybe the manufacturer baseline that analysis on a dry thread interface.
Yeah, it's probably at this point worth noting that like even torque wrenches aren't perfect. I mean, we kind of hinted at this at the beginning that it's just kind of taking in it's assuming that things are all moving the way the fastener is designed to, and it's measuring the outcome or the final product of that clamping force, but it's not directly measuring the clamping force. And so there is, I guess, stack tolerances and stack differences that can lead to difficulty. And I've heard some people argue that because of that, torque wrenches don't matter, but I would go the other way and say, well, using a torque wrench just eliminates more of the variables that you're putting into the system. So
yeah, absolutely. I will say though that I'm the guy who pulls out the big torque wrench every once in a while when I am doing up crank bolts, just because I want to make sure that my dub bolt is exactly at 54 Newton meters or whatever, so I don't have to wrestle it when I need to take it off 6 months from now.
Same. Hello, just me interrupting in a slightly different tone to tell you that this is where the episode ends for those on our free feed. Members of Escape Collective get exclusive member-only podcast feeds that work with all popular podcast players. You'll also gain access to everything we do at escapecollective.com, including my threaded series focused at professional bicycle mechanics and wrenching enthusiasts alike. For more, head to escapecollective.com/geekwarning. Hope to see you soon.